Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Well. And on this week's episode, we are going to talk about cultivating self-awareness. It is not a new topic per se, but it certainly is interesting to explore from different angles. And our guest of the day today is Courtney E. Ackerman. Courtney is a mental health policy researcher for the state of California and an active author and independent research consultant. She has written 8 self-help books with practical tips and exercises for healthy living and greater well-being based on the principles and research of positive psychology, particularly the value of mindfulness, gratitude, empathy, and self-compassion. So she is our perfect guest for this topic, and I'm really excited to talk to her about this. Thanks so much for joining us on a Sunday. Courtney, how are you?
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm doing really good today. It's the last day of real summer here in Sacramento, California, and it's beautiful 91 degrees. And looking forward to fall actually starting here soon. So
Yeah.
it's a wonderful time of changing seasons.
Oh, that's so good. I like the change of season because it's always refreshing for you to kind of think about what's happening in your life, right? Which is perfect for this topic. We're talking about self-awareness. And I think, sometimes when the season starts, you kind of you have that excitement, you start to reflect. And then as you go through the days, you kind of go with the flow and you don't really pay much attention. And that's why this timing of where you are right now, and perhaps where we are here in Australia too, transitioning into spring and summer, it's kind of that really great time to do some self-reflection and have some self-awareness. It's particularly for me. I just think that it's a really good time to think about where my life has been going, and have a bit more self-awareness. And in fact, I've been journaling about this a bit more. So I'm excited to talk about this topic. Before we do that, though, I'm curious about your work because it seems like you've written a lot of books and seems like you work independently and you're probably really into this area, and the bio probably doesn't speak everything about your work. So I have a few questions about that. First of all, how did you get into this field?
Yeah, so I got into this field in graduate school. So in undergrad, I was really interested in psychology. I always had been, just really curious about the way that our minds work, the way that we interact with each other, the way that we interact with ourselves. I think that traveling early in my life really made a big difference there because I saw other ways of living, other places, other people, other cultures. And it was also fascinating, right? That there's so many different ways to live, and none of them are right or wrong. They're just different. And so that really sparked some curiosity in me that I've just kept pursuing. And so I finally made it to graduate school, and I went to Claremont Graduate University that has a track for positive psychology in particular. And I read up on it when I was applying, and I was like, oh my God, this is it. This is the thing that I've been looking for. It's psychology, but it's focused on how we thrive. It's focused on empowerment, on flourishing, rather than just, mental illness and diagnoses and abnormal things that can happen. And it was the perfect thing for me and for my interests.
Mm. Yeah, that's really good to hear because I think not a lot of us can say, oh, that we were so interested in this in our undergrad and then we, continue to do it in postgrad and so on. I really love hearing these stories because for me, I'm just Like, I know that I was interested in psychology, which is why now I'm here doing this, but I never actually studied psychology. So that's another interesting part about life. You never know where it's going to take you. And you already sort of explained why you chose the field already. But I'm really curious about the books that you've written because, 8 books, not a small number at all. So, how's that journey been? And please share a bit more about some of the books with us. Maybe perhaps our audience could relate to them and might want to pick them up and read them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of have a niche that I've found and kind of cultivated over the last several years, and that niche is somewhere between research and application. I went to grad school. I did my own research. I was sort of embedded in that research world, and it's great, and you can learn a lot from it, and it's very interesting. But I noticed that there was a really big disconnect between the world of research and the world of actually applying it. There's just such a big gap, and the jargon and the difficult to understand explanations that researchers and academics use don't make that any easier. So I kind of found my niche in taking those research findings and then reprocessing them, translating them, creating this little package, this little actionable package of information that people could take and apply, use in their own lives. Because there's a lot of really great stuff that comes out of research that we just don't have a great translation for. So that's what really got me interested in doing this work. That's what got me interested in writing these books. And I think, like most people that get into psychology, that get into self help, they get into a lot of fields. Really, is you want to help yourself, and so you figure out how to help yourself, and then once you do that, or as you continue doing that because you're never done, you want to share that with others. So my books are very much written for me and for people like me who just want to be better, who want to have like really great practical ways to just improve ourselves, to learn, to grow, and to become the sort of people that we really want to be. So, as you mentioned, I have 8 self-help books that are published. They're mostly on positive psychology topics. So I have books on self-compassion, books on meditation and mindfulness, books on strengths and flourishing and journaling exercises and even stretches. They're all just really, really like those little actionable packages of information. Most of them have these exercises that are only like a page or two long. So it's really easy to just flip through and pick something, do it really quick, and then hopefully get a little boost, for the rest of your day, whether that's a little boost of joy or maybe self-confidence, or maybe, working through like forgiving yourself for a mistake. But it's just all focused on becoming the best version of yourself that you can be.
Mm.
My books, I hopefully are empowering for everyone to know that they can take this information, they can take a charge, and they can take active steps towards building the life that they want to have.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly sound empowering to me because, I think you're so right in saying that there's this disconnect between research and application because we read a lot about the different research out there, what it means. Even in this context of today's topic, I'm sure we're going to explore that there's perhaps a lot of research about self awareness, but there's not much, I think, application in the sense that we don't really know how we're going to use that in our daily lives. We don't know how we're going to cultivate that step by step because it's such a vague concept. It's kind of like, yeah, everyone talks about self awareness, but what is it really? And how does that translate to us carrying ourselves through our lives? So we're going to explore that soon. I'm excited to talk about that. Before we do, we have a part where we get to know you a bit better in this called Have You Met Courtney? Generally, normally I say we'll get some of your recommendation, but you know what? Let's jazz it up and maybe talk about things that you love, just some of your favorite things that you would love to share with our audience. So, first of all, what is your favorite book?
That's really hard. I struggle with these questions that are like pick one thing. But if I have to pick one book right now, the one that has been most impactful and I think most helpful for me is a relatively new book. I just read it last year. It's called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. Absolutely adore that book, which doesn't mean that at times it's not hard to read. Sometimes it is tough to read because it is looking at basically our current society, how it's set up, and that it is really not structured in a way that is conducive to our well being. It's not structured in a way that is easy for us to get our needs met, to find happiness, to find meaning. But it is hopeful in that it acknowledges that. And it helps you feel a lot less alone with things that you're struggling with because it shows you that we're really all struggling with a lot of the same things. It talks about the impacts of trauma, but it also talks about how you can recover, how you can heal, how you can become more resilient after trauma. And I think it's just a really excellent read. It's a long read. I think it's like 500 pages, but it's just packed full of really good information and really good, expansive ideas. So, I think it's great for anyone who's like, oh, I'm feeling really depressed. What's wrong with me? Or I have such high anxiety. What's wrong with me? Or I just can't motivate myself. What's wrong with me? Because this book will help you see that it's not really about you. It's about our environment, and our environment is really tough. And our environment is one that is like brand new for humans in terms of our species, right? Like just a few thousand years ago, we lived completely different lives, and our brains were really not evolved for like this digital world we're in today. So, we're all struggling. There's stuff that's tough for all of us, but there's solidarity in that. So love that book. Highly recommend it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. I think this is the second time that someone has talked about this book. I'm not sure if it was on this show or on the other show that I was hosting about happiness, but it's kind of when it keeps repeating, there's something there, right? So now that you're kind of sharing a bit more about the book, I was Googling it when you were talking about it. I'm like, okay, that sounds really interesting. I will definitely have to read it now. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. Next one is a movie. What is your favorite movie, if you have one?
Again, such a hard question to answer because there's so many that I could pick, but I thought that I would just sort of wait until like this moment and then pick one on the spot. And I think I'm gonna have to go with The Matrix. I love The Matrix. That movie from I think it was like 1999. Keanu Reeves. The whole red pill, blue pill scene. I love that movie. I think it probably like started my love of sci-fi. I loved that it had such an innovative plot, such an innovative mechanism, right? That the world that we live in is all constructed, and that
Yeah.
there's this whole other like dimension, really, this whole other alternate reality that's happening at the same time. And while I don't think that we're all currently plugged into the matrix, I think that idea can be expanded to a lot of things, right? Like what is the matrix around you that you're not seeing? What is the culture? What are the interwoven, beliefs and ideas and assumptions that we make that aren't necessarily true, you know? So I like that movie gets you to ask questions. It kind of flips things on their head. And it's just a really fun, like, nonstop sort of action movie. And I am, of course, like a feminist, and I love that, Trinity, the female character, is like just really badass. So
Yeah.
lots of good things to say about The Matrix.
Yeah. That's really great to hear from your perspective. Yeah, definitely a lot of layers of things that we can look at there. I actually got into The Matrix like 2 years ago, a
Oh,
year
really?
ago. Like, yeah, finally. I was
When the
like,
new one
oh,
came out?
I don't remember why. I think it was on my Netflix recommendation. I didn't even know the new one was coming out. And then I was like, oh, Keanu Reeves, like, this guy from what is that movie? I forgot the name now. But yeah, anyway, I was like, oh, that guy. And then a lot of people started talking about it. I was like, okay, now let's watch it. So yeah, relatively new to it, but I totally agree with you. It's a really great movie. So now, I know that not a lot of people listen to podcasts. I wonder if you're one of those people that actually do listen to podcasts, and if you do, what is your favorite one?
Yeah, I definitely listen to podcasts. Again, I have like so many that I would like to recommend. But if I had to narrow it down to one, I would pick, and this one actually isn't even running anymore. I think it was just for like a brief moment in time in 2020. but it's called the Feminist Survival Podcast. It's by Emily and Amelia Nagoski. So they're twin sisters. They're both researchers. Emily is most known for her book, and now she has a podcast on it too, I think, called Come As You Are, which is all about like sexuality and particularly female sexuality. But the Feminist Survival Podcast is like, I think they described it as the podcast for people who are basically giving everything they've got and still feel like they're not doing enough. And I think it came out like during the pandemic, during 2020, and it was just like such a product of its time. And it helped me feel very seen, right? That I was trying really hard to like do everything right, trying really hard to like juggle all of these different expectations and just really try to do good, understanding that there's so many problems, so many like social justice issues, so many things going wrong in the world that I want to try to, contribute to the solutions. It was a helpful reminder that I can keep doing that, but that nothing is entirely on my shoulders. And that what I really need to do is take really good care of myself first, before I try to take care of anyone else. So that was
Yeah.
a really good reminder. It's about, burnout and just how to actually rest and recover and heal so that you can then become that, best version of yourself that can get all these things done and contribute to whatever causes or things you're passionate about.
Yeah, that's so great. I love their book, Burnout. I think I've read it about 2 times now. Yeah, twice. Um, and yeah, it's so good. And exactly like what you're saying, you gotta first take care of yourself before you want to take care of anybody else. And burnout can be tough to navigate because it's invisible. It's like this little thing that you can't really name sometimes. You just know that something is off. And I think that, that self-awareness that you are burnt out is so important. I've been talking about it so much on this show because I myself been going through that. And I'm like, it's so good to realize, first of all, that there's that factor. And then there's the taking care of yourself and recharging and recovering. So yeah, I think that's a really great recommendation. Even if it doesn't run anymore, I think, if our audience is interested, they can still check the podcast out. I'm interested in getting to know them more because I really like their writing styles. I never knew they had a podcast. So in the next question, I know that we sort of briefly mentioned the word famous, but let's forget about that. I just want to ask you who your role model is, if you have one.
Yeah. If we're thinking about someone famous, then I would say Brene Brown is a role model for me. Brene Brown, for anyone who doesn't know her, she's absolutely fabulous. She's a researcher. She's got some great like TED Talks. I think she also did like this big Netflix special where she talked about her research, but she's focused on vulnerability and shame. And those are like two very interesting and kind of sensitive topics. But I love that she lives her values. She talks about how important it is to be vulnerable, to be open with people, to let people in and to just sort of be who you are, be authentic. And that's one of my core values is authenticity. And I just love how she shows up. She shows up as herself. She struggles with shame just like we all do, but she's open about it, and that's such a beautiful thing, and it's such a like inspirational thing for other people too. So she's inspired me, and that's who I want to be like. That's who I want to emulate. Being open, being vulnerable, and being authentic.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love Brene Brown. And anytime someone mentions Brene Brown, I'm just like, yay. Yeah, she's definitely one of my role models too, especially having gone to know this space of psychology and, all the work that it takes a lot of research, but also it takes a lot of translation. And I feel like Brene is really great at that. She shares her own stories. Every single book of hers has that element. She shares her own stories and how that means, how that translates. And like you're saying, she lives her values, which is really it's just something different from other books because a lot of the time you read books and then it's mainly theory and this is what in my research this is what is shown, but rarely do they say about how they sometimes also mess up themselves and how they learn. through the process. And I think that's what's so great about Brene. So yeah,
Right.
totally agree
I
with you. Love that.
love that authenticity, that openness, that, yeah, I screw up sometimes too, all the time. Here's the last time I did it, you know?
Yeah.
I really love that. It's rare.
Yeah, it's so good. Finally, in this part, I would love to know if you've taken a course that left a really strong impact on you. I know probably a long time ago since you took a course, or maybe a recent time. So I wonder what it is.
Yeah, I've taken so many courses that are really burned in my brain, but I think the one that's popping up right now was, forensic psychology.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, forensic psychology was just absolutely fascinating, and, for anyone who doesn't know, it's psychology applied to, like, criminal justice, right? So, like, people who, display deviant behavior, abnormal behavior, antisocial behavior. It's looking at that overlap, and so, like, while I am definitely this, positive psych-focused person, and I'm, like, all about thriving and compassion and gratitude, I'm also interested in, like, when things go in the other direction. And I think the biggest, like, kind of overall lesson that I took from that is, so much of how people turn out later is influenced by their childhood. It's influenced by early experiences, and often not in super straightforward ways. But I love this idea that, people aren't necessarily, like, born bad. It's that sometimes bad things can happen to people, and it impacts their development, how they turn out, and then the choices they make later. Which means that, we actually have a lot more control over how people turn out than we think. It's not just like a coin flip, you know? There's a lot of places where we can intervene, where we can make better choices, and where we can help and support people to develop into, best possible versions of themselves. It's not a lost cause.
yeah. Oh, definitely. I think that's such a great point that you raised there. And that kind of reminds me of Orange is the New Black, the TV show. If anyone has watched that, it's just so true. Things happen. Sometimes you were not inherently bad or you were born bad. And I don't think anyone is born bad. It's just like life circumstances, childhood trauma, so many things can play into that. And that's why psychology is such a great space to be in because you understand human behavior. But we digress. I think if we continue to talk about that, we could continue all day. Now, let's talk about today's topic because we're here to talk about well being and self awareness. And I know that by this point into the podcast, everyone is probably very curious about it. Now, because the show is about well being, I would love to hear from your perspective what well being means to you personally.
Yeah. Well, first, well-being it's holistic. It's all encompassing. It's about your general mental, emotional, and physical state. That kind of considers all of your major domains of life. Intimate relationships, family and friends, striving towards goals and finding purpose, learning and growth, recreation, kind of all those major areas of life. Um, but it's also not a static measure. It's something that's constantly changing. It's a really fluid concept. So I like to, like, kind of set those expectations beforehand, because it's really important context. But well-being is generally just being satisfied and empowered in your own life. It's a state of being comfortable in being you, but having the support and having the agency to face your obstacles, solve your own problems, and to find meaning, joy, and peace in your daily life.
Yeah, definitely. I really love that definition. And then the word holistic really encompasses a lot of things because I think a lot of the times when we discuss well being, it's kind of like a one sided conversation or it's just one facet of so much more. Like, for example, if I talk to my family, what do you think? Like, how's your well being going? They probably will mainly think about physical health. And that's pretty much that. And so all of the other aspects that you mentioned kind of gets sort of disregarded in the background somehow. And I feel like yeah, this really strong emphasis in our society that like if you look like you're doing well, then that means your well-being is great. Like, I mean, no, not really. Like someone can look like they have everything together and their well-being is falling apart. And I think that's because we think that it's just this one tiny thing for well-being. It's not. And so that's kind of my personal observation when it comes to misconceptions that people have about well-being. But in your work, I'm sure you've encountered even more. So what would be some of the biggest misconceptions you think people have about well-being?
One of the biggest misconceptions, and one that I have, struggled with and am still kind of working to unlearn, is that that I don't have great well-being if I'm not happy like all of the time, right? That I need to be happy all of the time, or my well-being is not great. But that's really not what it's about. It's not about like always feeling happy. It's about feeling content or neutral, or even like having negative experiences or struggling with difficult emotions, but still having that sense that you're okay. You know, you can like have a horrible day, feel all kinds of cruddy things. You feel like grumpy and sad and angry, lonely. Um, but just having good well-being is knowing that all of those feelings are transitory, that they are all temporary, and that eventually, you're going to feel better again, and just being okay with that, being okay with not being okay. None of us are going to feel happy all the time. That would actually be a terrible thing, because if we're happy all the time, we would never have any like motivation to grow or to learn anything new or to try new things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's not about just feeling happy. It's
Yeah.
about feeling okay.
Yeah. Definitely. I totally agree with that. Happiness is such a tough thing to navigate because it can be toxic, and we have a whole show on happiness. So if anyone is interested, the show is called Sarah Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, and I also host that show, so please tune in. But I think I love that you said you don't have to be happy all the time for you to have a sense of well-being. In fact, I think we learn more about our well-being in times of unhappiness or whatever else people would like to call, the tough emotions that they have to go through. And it could be anything. It doesn't have to be just simply the opposite of happiness, which is unhappiness. There could be so many things that happen. And I think the first thing that I sort of thought about when you said that is, you know what? There's that sense of self-awareness when you don't feel great. And then you start to think, oh, I don't feel great because, and then sometimes you can fill in the blank. Sometimes you cannot do that at all. And it's kind of hard because this is what I'm learning continuously. I'm just kind of figuring out, oh, I'm not feeling great because this triggers me. I'm not feeling great because that is not as per how I want it to be. And then I learn to manage my own expectations. I learn to navigate through my own tough emotions. And it all starts with self-awareness, because otherwise I would just be a crybaby. Like, oh, it doesn't go my way. Why? you know and I think that is such a good way to kind of see this growth journey that everybody has. And I used to be a crybaby, perhaps sometimes. I don't remember that time in so much detail, but I do remember a time where that sense of self-awareness is not there. It's just more like, oh, like I just want to get it off my chest and complain about what's going wrong. But in fact, maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe the only thing that is wrong is what's in here in my head. And I think that's the most interesting part of self-awareness to me. But it's still kind of vague. Like if, for our audience, they might say, I do have self-awareness. What are you talking about? Everybody does. What if we don't? Because sometimes we just go about lives doing certain things and we don't really know if we actually do that out of self-awareness or just out of autopilot or whatever else that is driving us. So, what is that sense of self awareness and how do we know that we have them?
Yeah. Yeah. Self awareness, I think, is actually a little bit easier to define than well being. So this is like an easier question. It's the ability to see yourself clearly and objectively, or as objectively as possible. Humans are not probably ever going to be completely objective about themselves, or maybe about anything, right? We think that we could be really, really objective and really reasonable, but emotions are sneaky and ubiquitous. They get in there, and they color our perceptions. They influence how we see things. Um, but self awareness it's just about understanding that while our thoughts are intimately connected to ourself, we are not our thoughts. We are the ones who are observing our thoughts. We are the thinker, and it's understanding that. There's this whole sort of separate self, and that we can kind of turn that camera around and watch it. We can watch ourselves thinking, we can watch ourselves feeling. We can be that watcher, that observer. and understand, when we're feeling a certain way. We can progress to understanding why we feel a certain way. Even looking back into, what from our childhood or from our experiences or maybe recent experiences is influencing the way that we feel. So there's sort of multiple steps, multiple layers, and the first one is just being aware of like what you're thinking and how you're feeling. And even that alone can be really tough for people, especially if it's not something that they've practiced before. Just starting with how am I feeling right now can be a really, really great first step to building self-awareness.
Mm.
But yeah, it's all about, it's all about being able to self-reflect, being able to introspect, understanding your own patterns and where your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors come from.
Yeah, definitely. I think a big component of that you mentioned is, noticing how we're feeling. But I think another aspect is actually noticing how we're doing as well, like what our behaviors are telling us, because a lot of the time we don't even notice the things that we do repeatedly. And I caught myself the other day, and I was kind of like, oh, this is so interesting. I never really thought about the fact that I do this frequently. And then I started to think about why I do that frequently. And then I was like, oh, I tend to do this when I feel so and so. So I think everything is interconnected when we try to look at self-awareness in that perspective, because it can be really hard. You just go about your day and you do things that are routine. Maybe they seem routine to you, but in fact they are not that routine. I feel like there's always a reason why we do things. And sure, you can have a really healthy routine in the morning, and then in the evening it's not so much that healthy, because sometimes you're driven by emotions, feelings, things that happen throughout the day. And I find that to be fascinating. I'm just like constantly learning about this. And I think self awareness plays such a big part in that, not just noticing our feelings, but also our behaviors and translating that into, oh, that is because of my feelings, my emotions. Super interesting.
Yeah, and it is really interesting, and it's scary at first. It's scary to be like really honest about ourselves and what drives us and our flaws and our faults. But if you approach it with curiosity, then you're able to be, non-judgmental about it. Like we're not here to blame or shame or point any fingers. It's kind of fascinating when you can learn to be a little bit more objective with yourself and like say you struggle with, junk food and snacking too much or something. It's really fascinating when you figure out like, oh, when I have an experience with someone else where I don't feel heard, that's when I, have a craving and that's when I go home and snack. And then now that you know that like there's this, if then you can get in between the if and then and you can make a change. There's an opportunity to intervene there. Um and you don't need to like be mean to yourself to do it. You don't need to be like, "Oh, what's wrong with you for wanting to snack?" or like, "Oh, you and your cravings again." You just go like, "Oh, a light bulb moment. Like this is when I crave something and this is what I can do about it instead." Or you know what? Sometimes it's just like eat the junk food and, it's one coping strategy. It's okay to do that every now and then.
Yeah, actually, I did talk to a nutritionist about that the other day on the show, and she said the same thing. Like if it helps, it's fine. Just don't do it every day, and you'll be fine. Sometimes once in a while, that is totally healthy. And if you want to eat something and it helps you, why don't you do it? But with awareness, of course. Like okay, I'm gonna enjoy it. Why not? And I think that, yeah, savor. It's so important. But it's very interesting what you said. You can sort of notice and you catch yourself when you do certain things out of, let's say, this emotion, that feeling, this situation, or because of that person's behavior. So there's a lot that happens in our lives, and as you were saying at the beginning, well-being is holistic and it has so many different facets to it. We get influenced a lot on the daily, I would say, because we always interact with the world, interact with ourselves, interact with other people. And so when we get that influence, sometimes we don't notice why we're doing certain things. So now that we have, let's say we have self awareness, we are able to judge from an objective perspective. We understand what is going on, and we are sort of able to navigate through that and intervene when it's the right time. How would that help our well being?
Yeah, that it's incredibly helpful for our well-being, and I think the biggest way is that, when we have self-awareness, we're able to see ourselves more clearly, see our actions more clearly, and we're able to judge whether they are in alignment with what we really value, with our standards, our standards for rightness or goodness or moral standards, whatever standards you have. Um, when you're able to be objective about it, then you can measure yourself and how you're living up to these standards. And that's a really beautiful opportunity to improve, to get yourself back in alignment with your values if you're not, or to reassess the values and the standards to begin with. Because sometimes we measure ourselves against our standards and we find that we're wanting, but self-awareness can help you like look at those standards and decide whether you even want to keep that standard or not. You know, like especially for women, there's this sort of like have it all standard, right? That you need to be like an amazing mother and an amazing daughter and an amazing spouse and an amazing, whatever you do at work. And you're supposed to keep your house clean and put, great food on the table. You're supposed to do all of these things, right? You're supposed to do it all so well. But that's really an unreasonable standard. It's an unreasonable standard for anyone. And so having self-awareness, you can catch yourself when you are like not meeting those standards, but instead of, beating yourself up over it, you can say like, oh, it's the standard that's wrong. So there's kind of like in two ways you can use
Yeah.
self-awareness to either bring yourself more in alignment with your values, which is great, right? You want to be more in alignment with your values, or you can question those values and those standards, and then you can change those into more reasonable and effective ones that are actually going to help you live a better life.
Yeah.
But then aside from that, it just opens you up to growth. Having higher self-awareness is correlated with a lot of really good things like better relationships and being better at work, being more effective in meeting your goals, positive interactions with others. And it's all of those things that help us learn and improve. So self-awareness is sort of the foundational piece to, becoming the people that we want to be, to
Yeah.
improving, to becoming our full, authentic, highest selves.
Mm. Oh yeah, I've recently heard the concept of high itself, and I'm, intrigued. I've been learning a lot more about it, and I find it fascinating. It's just kind of like you're one self, but you have your current self, you have your highest self, and all starts with self awareness. Um, but I find it also interesting because not everyone is familiar with this. Obviously, I think I read up on it, and you're the researcher here, so we probably know a bit more than the average people. And for you particularly, a lot more than the average people. So to break it down to people that are new to this and kind of wondering whether they have it or not, what would be some signs that they lack self awareness?
Yeah, so there's a lot of signs that you might be lacking in self awareness. And I just want to preface this by saying that, none of this is about being mean to ourselves or shaming or judging. But some signs are, if you're constantly running on autopilot, you're just kind of floating through your day, you're not really aware and intentional about the choices that you're making, then you're probably lacking in self awareness. People who are lacking in self awareness, they might feel like they have to do things. I'm putting like air quotes around have to do things a lot, rather than acknowledging and understanding that, they're making choices about how to behave. They don't really have to do anything. Um, they can also be really defensive, maybe taking things personally and seeing any criticism as an attack on themselves rather than an opportunity to grow. They might find it pretty easy to blame others because it's scary to admit that we have flaws, right? So it's a lot easier to deny or avoid them, and like blaming things on other people makes that a lot easier to do. They might also have a lot of conflict in their relationships, including at work. They might struggle to collaborate with their colleagues. They might feel misunderstood or even victimized a lot. In their romantic relationships and friendships, they might find that they end quickly, or even that people might avoid them. Because we're generally drawn to people that are self-aware and compassionate, and will shy away from people who are not. But I think the biggest sign that there's a lack of self-awareness is, we all have this internal critic voice. We all have this inner nagging voice that's telling us all kinds of nasty things about how we're, not good enough or not smart enough, or we're too emotional or we're too needy. Um, Everyone has that, but when we're lacking in self-awareness, we're not able to see that for what it is. We're not able to separate that out from ourselves, and we automatically believe it instead of challenging it. So I'd say that that's probably the biggest indicator that someone is lacking in self awareness is just automatically believing that really mean, critical inner voice. But the good thing is that none of this is permanent. It's not hopeless. Like self-awareness can be built. So, if anyone is hearing these indicators and they're like, "Oh, yep, that's me. Oh, yep, that's me too." There's nothing wrong with you. There's a lot of things that you could do to build that self-awareness and to be kinder to yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think the point of being self-aware is to criticize ourselves. It's just more catching ourselves when we're doing certain things that might be unhelpful to ourselves. And I think that's the most important piece. And it requires kindness because when you're, beating yourself up, you're not going to get anything done. And I've noticed that for myself. Like I recently, started to think a lot about like what's been going on in my life and then, journal about it. And then sometimes I have this tendency to, and I think very similar to other people, a lot of our audience might relate to this, just kind of like, oh, why were you so stupid? And then I was like, no, wait, hang on a minute. It's okay. I made a mistake. I forgive myself. And, moving forward, this is going to be helpful if I do so and so. And I think it's just so interesting when I start practicing that because I never thought I never thought that I could actually integrate it into my life through self-awareness because I always thought that, like, growing up, maybe people might relate to this or not. I thought, you know what, like, I'm great as I am. And then I grew up a little more and I was like, oh, okay, I'm great, but I need to grow.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and the but I need to grow part is it kind of stings because you kind of like, oh, I thought I was a great person. Actually,
Happy.
yes, and I can grow further.
Yes. I love
So
that. I love that right? It's like the ability to hold these two, like, seemingly in conflict ideas at once, right? Like,
yeah, it's
I
hard.
am a great and valuable and worthy person, and I screw up all the time, right?
Yeah,
Like, and there's room for growth. It's not but, it's
yeah,
and. Like, both of these
yeah.
things are true at the same time.
Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation with a friend the other day, and I don't remember why we started talking about this topic, but we were basically talking about like how there are stupid behaviors that we both have, and he said, We're not stupid. We're smart people who do stupid things." And I was like, "Dude, that's a really good point. Thanks. I like that."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, we all do stupid things, at least
yeah,
occasionally, right? Like, we're
yeah,
not all stupid because we sometimes make stupid mistakes. That's just being
yeah.
human.
Yeah, definitely. Which is why it's kind of hard because when you start to integrate self-awareness into different areas of life, you tend to perhaps get more critical of yourself. Because, like I think this is the caveat. Like for some people, it's just easier for them to have no self-awareness. Like everything I do is great, I don't care, and I'm just gonna go ahead and do things my way. And it takes like I feel like they don't think and they don't have that weight in their head versus when we start to integrate self-awareness into everything we do, we have that checklist in like this mental checklist in our mind, and it takes so much more to process. But like you were saying, it's going to improve the quality of our relationships, our work, our own lives and our well-being, and that's great. So how do we actually incorporate self-awareness into different areas? Because I think the way that we incorporate self-awareness into work would be different from relationships, and it would definitely be different from personal goals. So let's look at those three areas: work, relationships, and personal goals.
I might have to disagree with you there. I think that self-awareness is a really adaptable tool. So I
Hmm.
think that once you start developing it, you can kind of use it in anywhere, in any domain of your life.
Mm,
I don't think the self-awareness is different necessarily, like at work or, with a loved one or when you're striving towards your goals. I think the
mm,
self-awareness is one big all-encompassing tool in your toolbox, and that it can be applied everywhere. Once you start practicing it, it gets easier and easier no matter where you are.
mhm.
But I think it could probably be helpful to like pick one area, where you really like, maybe where you're struggling, maybe where you're like seeing the biggest like gap between what is and what you want. And you can start practicing it there. But I think once you're really starting to build self awareness, it's not going to stick to one domain. And
Mhm.
I think it's going to look pretty similar, no matter where you're applying it, because it's the same basic idea of, you know, taking stock of thinking, how do I feel right now? What are the thoughts that are in my head right now? How am I behaving? Is it how I want to behave? Is it how I want to feel? Where is this all coming from? And that's applicable everywhere.
Mm. Ah, that's a great point. So we have this toolbox and we can use it in all domains. And you sort of mentioned a few steps there already. Would there be anything that we need to look out for in this process? Because obviously, some people might practice this for the first time and they freak out because they don't know
Yeah.
what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, it's really uncomfortable. It's super uncomfortable. Like you're not going to get it right the first time, and you're not going to get it right even the hundredth time, but you're going to get better and better.
Hmm.
I think the one thing to kind of be on the lookout for is where we tend to be dishonest with ourselves. I think that's the biggest issue, is because we don't want to admit that that we're not in
Yeah.
alignment with our values, or that we did something wrong, or that we're not perfect. It can be very scary, for
Mm.
ourselves and for our ego to admit that. So I think the biggest challenge is just to really commit to honesty with yourself. Um, but you have a lot of defenses up for that. There's so many like, well, but this, and but they said this, and but someone else did this, and that's why I feel the way I do. It's very easy to get caught up in those like
Yeah, the blame
shifting
game.
blame. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the biggest pitfall. And what helps with that is really being intentional about choosing self-compassion. Um, it's practicing over and over and over again that, yes, I make mistakes, I do things wrong, and also I'm a lovely person and it's okay, you know? And the better you are at just sort of accepting that, you have flaws and that you're working on it and that you're still great, the easier it will get to practice self-awareness and to be like, oh, I really screwed up there. Oh, okay. Well, let's think about how and why and what we can do
Yeah.
different next time.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's such a hard thing to navigate because we all have egos. It's just how big it is, I guess.
Yes.
It
Yeah, we all
varies
have
from
egos.
person. Yeah, varies from person to person. But I find that I think this is probably something that I picked up from um, listening to and reading Brene Brown's book actually, where like sometimes you just have this tendency to say no, that's not my fault, or oh no, it's all great, and then you catch yourself and then you go back and you apologize, and you know what, that piece is so important, not just for our self-awareness but also for our growth as humans, because being able to say I messed up, here's how I'm going to fix it, or I messed up, I apologize, is so hard. It's harder than it sounds.
It is. It's really
Yeah.
hard, especially if you've never really done like a true apology before, because like, especially as kids or, some of us even into adulthood, your apology might be like, well, I'm sorry, I guess, or like, I'm
Yeah.
sorry you feel that way, right? Which is like
Yeah.
such a cop out apology. But if you've
Yeah.
never done an apology where you really say like, hey, I screwed up, full stop, no ifs, ands, or buts, right? I screwed up.
Yeah.
I did this. I understand that. I acknowledge it. I should have done this. You know, here's how it impacted you. Um, I'm sorry. Here's how I'm going to do better. That's terrifying. Like, that's legitimately terrifying to just say, like, I screwed up. I made a big mistake. I did something wrong. And
Yeah.
a lot of people are not like ready to do that. They
Yeah.
don't have like the self-awareness and the self-compassion and all of those things that you need to say like I screwed up.
Yeah. It takes a lot of hard work to be able to get there, which is why we are talking about this topic. It's not as easy as it sounds. So, I'm still learning. And I thought that I had a pretty good sense of self-awareness, but I'm still learning as I go. And I think there's so much more to practice because, you practice today and then tomorrow you might forget or you might slip up and then you have to go back into it again. And speaking of which, let's now go into our practice part where we can be a bit more generous with our audience about a practice, because obviously self awareness in itself is a practice from what you have told me. And there are all these steps that we can do. And, there's so much that we need to remember and look out for. But for those that are new to this and just get started and they have to, like really take stock of how they have been feeling and behaving and things like that, but they just kind of like, okay, I'm a little lost here. What would be a practice that you recommend to them so that they can start cultivating self-awareness?
Yeah. So my most basic and most frequently used practice is something I just call the self check-in. And the self check-in is just carving out a few minutes to pause. That's really important. I want to stress that you have to pause, right? It's just so easy to keep going in our day and brush past things and go, okay, well, I'll think about it later. But self-awareness is about building in the moment understanding of yourself. So you really have to pause. You have to stop whatever you're doing, maybe sit down, maybe pull over on the side of the road if you need to, take a break from work, step outside at home, whatever you need to do, but like really pause and just be present with yourself. And ask yourself some questions. So the questions that I like to ask myself, kind of depending on, what's going on, what the situation is. But the basics are, what are you feeling right now? What emotion are you feeling? And I have a really handy suggestion for people who don't have a great grasp on emotions yet. Because some people are, they just didn't grow up with a lot of like attention paid to emotions. I think especially men in particular struggle with this because really society doesn't let them have a lot of emotions. We're like, okay, you can be angry or you can be content, and that's it. You can't feel anything else. So if people, particularly men, but anybody, everyone can struggle with this, is not really sure like what they're feeling or what emotions there are to choose from. There's some really great tools out there, like the emotions wheel, or like an emotions chart, or even just a list of emotions. And it's really helpful, like even in the moment, to be like, what are you feeling right now? And to pull up that resource and to read through the list and be like, oh, okay, that one sounds about right. Yep. Okay, that one too. Yep. So it's not cheating. It's helpful.
Yeah.
So first is just what are you feeling right now? And then building on that is what are you feeling in your body? Where do you feel it? If I'm feeling guilt, sometimes that will manifest in my shoulders feeling heavy. I'll feel like a burden and I'll actually feel a heaviness in my shoulders. Or maybe my stomach will be upset. It'll feel like my stomach is in knots because I feel bad about something. Or if I feel anxious, I can tell that my chest feels a little bit tight and I can feel
Yeah.
my heart rate is a little bit higher than usual. Um, so, checking in with your body, checking in with what your emotions actually physically feel like is a really good way to make those connections. The next question I'll ask myself is, what prompted you to feel this way? So that is, if I'm feeling anxious right now, what is it that made me feel this way, or what prompted that feeling? What provoked it? What brought it out? Is it, something that someone just said? Is it some standard that I have for myself, that I'm not meeting and I feel anxious about it? Is it like I, saw a movie that reminded me of, something that bothered me years ago, or like I saw a text message from a friend and I feel uncomfortable about something with them? There's pretty much always some sort of reason why we're feeling the way we're feeling. It's rare to just, boom, feel anxious about nothing. There's usually something. So I ask myself, what prompted you to feel this way? Um, and then I'll ask sort of a follow-up, like, what else do you think it's connected to? What else could it be? Because sometimes there's a really obvious, first answer, but then there's like sneakier other answers. And it's like, okay, it seems like primarily I'm angry because the guy in front of me on the freeway slammed on his brakes, right? And that's really annoying and that's not safe driving, but it's not really something to be that angry about, right? Like, I stopped in time, no one got hurt. So it's like, okay, well, am I actually feeling just kind of grumpy about something else? And this is how it's coming out, because sometimes that's the case. I'm really
Mm.
angry about something else and it's just not like at the forefront. And the next question I ask myself is really like a deeper dive. And that is there a core belief or like a wound that is giving rise to these feelings? We can sometimes have really unhealthy, negative core beliefs like I'm not good enough, or or people will only love me if I give more than I receive, right? And these core beliefs that we don't necessarily think about consciously or check in on, they really influence how we interact and how we show up in the world. So that's sort of like a deeper level is there a core belief here that this is connected to? And what is it? And then the next step is, do I really agree with it? Do I really agree with this core belief, that you will not be loved unless you give more than you receive? Does that seem reasonable? Is that something that I would like put my Courtney stamp of approval on and send out into the world? Because if not, then I don't need to hang on to it. And so in that case, then the final question is, if not, then what would I rather choose to believe? What belief do I want to work on replacing it with? So instead of you have to give more than you receive, I could replace it with, when you love, you give, unconditionally. Or I could replace it with, I'm worthy of love no matter how much I give to others. So there's this set of questions, and I can repeat those again if that's helpful, because I realize I just sort of like fluidly like jumped from one to the other. But my first one is, what are you feeling right now? Second is, how does it feel in your body? Third is, what prompted you to feel this way? Fourth is, what else do you think it's connected to? Fifth, is there a core belief that's giving rise to these feelings? Six, do you agree with this core belief? And then the optional seven, if you don't agree with it, what would you rather choose to believe? And I really like this exercise because it's very empowering. It's also very straightforward. It only takes a couple of minutes. I mean, it could take longer if you want to get really deep, like if you want to do a deep introspective dive into whatever you're feeling. But you can do it pretty quickly and pretty easily, and you can do it anywhere. And it doesn't require any like fancy tools or resources or, apps. Like, you can just sit and do it in your own brain, or you can sit and jot it down on a piece of paper, or you can journal. But it's very accessible, and it's putting all of the power to make changes in your hands, because that's where it is.
Definitely. I love that. Well, thank you for sharing that. I really love those questions and will definitely practice them myself. Really helpful. Um, so now that we have covered theoretical aspects and practical aspects of self-awareness, there's really not much else that we're going to do apart from open mic, because here's your platform to talk about anything you would like to talk about. I think we've covered self-awareness in depth today. And so before we let you go, I would love to hear from you what else you're passionate about. I know you're probably passionate about a lot of different things, and I wonder what you would like to share with our audience today.
Yeah, there's so many things that I'm passionate about and that I could talk about at length. But the thing that I'm going to choose is, it's something that sometimes something comes up that is just in one kind of domain of life, and you're like, okay, that's interesting. I'm going to work on this. But sometimes you find something that is sort of interwoven between multiple domains. Something comes up at work, and then that same idea or problem comes up in your personal life as well. And then maybe, the same theme comes up when you're talking to a friend about something they're struggling with. And whenever that happens, I take a really good look at it, because I think, this is like the universe, or, God, or whatever your idea is of a higher power, or just fate, right? Or just chance, whatever you happen to believe in. But it's pointing something out to you. It's showing you that there is a greater connecting theme here, and that, we should pay attention to it. And so my theme that's been coming up over the last year in particular, um, is that our boys and young men are really, really struggling right now. I think we're all struggling still coming out of the pandemic. I think that had a huge impact on us. I think quarantine was, really, really rough. Like, whether people agree with the quarantine and all of the procedures or not, it had really big impacts on us and our well-being, and particularly for young people. But what I'm seeing more and more is that the pandemic and the loneliness and the sense of distance that we try to close with digital means has been really, really tough for boys and young men. And so that's something that I am becoming more and more passionate about and educating myself on more and more. In my, 9 to 5 job, I work as a policy researcher for the Mental Health Commission for the state of California. And one of the projects that I've been leading over the last year is looking at firearm violence and mental health and how they overlap. And we're finding that, this might not be a surprise, but it's mostly like 95% boys and men that are the perpetrators of firearm violence and a lot of just violence in general. And they're also usually on the receiving end of it as well. And that indicates to me that there is something deeply problematic going on. And I am, as I mentioned earlier, a proud feminist and very, very strong in those feminist beliefs. And I am just so thrilled that there's been so much progress in terms of, carving out space for women and creating a world in which women can feel safe and empowered and supported. And there's still a long way to go there. But I think that in some cases, we've forgotten about the men. I think we have left some of our boys and men behind. We've told them a lot lately about what not to do, right? What not to be, how they should not be, what they should not do, what they should not like or say or think. But I think they're really lacking in what they should be doing, what they should be saying, what they should be thinking, who they should be following. And I think that that's why there's, this sort of whole darker side that has arisen in recent years, especially online. This very kind of harmful, toxic masculinity, misogynistic subculture that has sprung up. I think it's because boys and young men are really lost. They're really confused. They don't know who to turn to. They don't know where to go. And that often comes out in violence. And so just a few months ago, there was a CDC report that said that, our young girls are really, really struggling. A lot of high school girls have had, thoughts of suicide, have really struggled, have been dealing with assault. And one of the responses to this, really sad piece was, if you want to help young girls, you need to help young boys. Because that is, there's this interplay, this complex relationship between the two that can't really be separated out. So if one is struggling, we have to look at the other too. So my kind of personal and professional focus over the last year, increasingly more so, is figuring out what we can do better for boys and for young men. What kind of role models we can offer them, what sort of frameworks for understanding themselves and for growing we can give to them, what kinds of third spaces we can create that aren't school or home, that they can go and interact in safe and positive ways with other people their age, where they can find mentors, people older than them that they can look to and find wisdom. And what we can do to just channel all of this, incredible energy and drive that teenagers have, partially from crazy hormones, but what we could do with all of that to help them channel it in a really positive way instead of a way that's destructive to the self or to others. So my big passion lately is helping young boys and young men, and I do have some suggestions when it comes to that. There's a really, really great organization and newsletter that I've been following. And I'm just like double checking what the name is here because I think it's great, but I can't remember exactly what it's called. Next Gen Men. And so they're all about focusing on improving the lives of men and boys, but in a way that is sensitive to, the cultural context, that's sensitive to the struggles of women and people who are non-binary, but it is helping men understand what positive and healthy masculinity is, what it looks like, and how they can work towards it. So really, really recommend the organization Next Gen Men. And then this is a little bit more of like a tongue-in-cheek, lighter one. But for men who are struggling and who maybe don't feel super comfortable with doing, therapy or these more sort of emotion, soft and sensitive focused exercises, there is an organization called Man Therapy. And you could like just Google that, go to their website. And it's this like very like, masculine, like focused way of digging into like your thoughts and your feelings and improving yourself. But it's all like, are you a man? Do you have emotions? That's okay. And so it's just sort of like a funny, like lighthearted way of approaching self-improvement as a man. And so I think that's a really fun resource. I'm sure I have others. Also a podcast called the Man Enough Podcast, where they ask these sorts of questions, where they break down the toxic masculinity that exists, and they try to replace it with a more positive, healthy version of masculinity. They have some really good ideas, really good hosts, and they have great guests too. So I would recommend that as well.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It is a very important message right there. And, glad to hear that you've been doing a lot of work in this area because I'm sure that it's certainly needed. And, maybe a lot of people in our audience might resonate with this and want to contribute. And speaking of which, if they would like to reach out to you or get to know more about your work, where should they go?
Yeah, well, first they can find me on LinkedIn, Courtney E. Ackerman. They can connect with me there. People can also find me on Instagram. The handle there is Courtney E. Ackerman. And I'll out myself right now. I'm not very good at posting very often, but when I do, I try to share thoughtful, helpful stuff. So that's the two main places that people can find me. If they want to read some of my positive psychology focused work, they can find me on positivepsychology.com as a contributing author. And then if they want to read any of my books, you can find those on Amazon. You can find them Target, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, all the kind of major places where books are sold. Courtney E. Ackerman, and you'll find my 8 books on a variety of topics, hopefully one of which sounds interesting and helpful.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights podcast produced by the Wellbeing Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, we.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lungo. Thanks for tuning in.